Thank you, Ian Anderson, for being on Flute Unscripted. It is really a very big honor.
Well, I'm sure you've done this more often than I have. It seems sometimes I find myself confronting other flute players, which is a very weird experience because being in a rock band, you don't really meet other flute players. And I guess you play the flute yourself, do you?
I do. Yep, I've
Yeah,
been
I thought
playing
so.
for decades.
Well, it's an oddity, really, because I'd never. I mean, I am a flute player. It's what I've done for 53
Yeah.
years, but compared to other flute players, I don't think that's the way that I work. I write my own music. I come up with ideas, some of which I can play, some of which I have to learn to play because my ideas are maybe a little bit too advanced for my ability or my technique. So it I think of it as music. I don't think of myself primarily as a flute player. I'm a musician who happens to play, amongst other things, the flute, and that's what I'm
Right.
best known as. But whenever I meet other flute players, it's a bit scary. I realize that they too play that weird instrument and
Yeah, we
make
have that common bond.
usually much more melodious sounds than I do. But I
What
guess,
got you interested in picking it up in the first place? Because you were playing guitar before the flute.
yeah, I'm like all of my peers back in the mid '60s. Everybody wanted to be a guitar player. That
Right.
was the sexy thing to do. And I think probably from the age of 17 through 20, um, well, actually 19, 17 through 19, I was the guitar player. But I heard when I was, um, I guess when I was 18 years old, I heard Eric Clapton, who had just joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers at the time. And Clapton was, a great example of a white English working class blues musician. There were a few of them around. He was far and away the most accomplished. And that got me thinking that maybe I should think about an alternative to guitar, something that was not so commonplace. And it took me a few months before I finally got round to trading in my trusty Fender Stratocaster for another instrument, and for no good reason. I mean, literally no good reason. I just looked around on the wall of the music store because he wouldn't give me cash. He said, you can part exchange it for something else. And so I part exchanged it for a Shure Unidyne 3 microphone made in Chicago, Illinois. And on the wall, there was hanging a shiny flute. And I said, I'll have that, without really thinking what I was going to do with it or how to play it or anything. And I remember going off in the group van to do a gig, and I had this new, not well, actually, I think it probably was new. It was a very basic student model. It was a Selmer Gold Seal, and my pal Sir James Galway, oddly, it was his very first flute too. It was Selmer Gold Seal flute, and he hated his. He thought it was the worst thing in the world, and I rather liked mine, except for one thing. I couldn't play it. I couldn't get a note out of the damn thing because I thought
Yeah,
I was blowing as hard as I could into this hole at the top of the
classic.
instrument, and nothing came out except wheezing geriatric sounds. And and somebody said to me, "Well, it's a bit like blowing into the top of a bottle, like blowing into the top of a Coke bottle, and
Right.
you can get a noise." And I think it was some weeks or months later, I did manage to get a noise out of it, a note. But it was, I got the flute, I think, in July, and it was December when I finally managed to play one or two notes. And it's a testimony to the ergonomic excellence of Theobald Boehm that he
Yep.
um, put the keys where they just naturally seemed to go.
Mhm.
And without really trying too hard, I managed to play I think the first note I played was probably a G, followed by an E, followed by a tentative D, an A, which was easy, a B, which was easy. And, and I had the blues scale in E minor. So
Were you
it,
ever
and I could then play, I could play the guitar solos I used to play, I could now play them on the
Ah,
flute, albeit in
right.
one key.
Yeah.
So that just got me started. And for about the next 2 or 3 weeks over Christmas, I started to work on a few ideas. And by the middle of January, I was at the Marquee Club, the famous club in London that many of us started off
Yep.
in. And I was playing the flute, and people were paying attention to me, because it was an unusual thing to have a flute in a blues band. And so I got noticed for being the only flute player in town, at
Right.
least as far as the blues aficionados were concerned.
After that, did you have any interest in pursuing any sort of formal training or lessons with anyone? Or were you content with?
I've never had a flute lesson or any kind of a lesson in my
Well,
life since
I
I left
heard your
school. No.
I heard your daughter picked up flute at some point. Has
Well,
she ever
she was,
taught
yeah,
you? Yeah.
she was doing flute at school.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Probably because I told her it was easier than playing a cello or a violin. So she opted for the flute, and I gave her a flute, an old flute
Yeah.
one of my old stage flutes. At this point, I think it was an Artley flute, made in Elkhart, Indiana, and a typical American marching band instrument. It was robust. It was fairly crudely made, but it was a little bit more enduring than the rather fragile Selma Gold Seal. And she was learning to play from the earliest lesson, to read the musical stave and
Mhm.
play with the correct fingering. And I offered to try and help her with something, and she I think she played me a note of E, and I said, well, you've got your fingers on that key down there. It doesn't need to be there. And she said, oh, well, that's what it says in the book. And I said, no, don't worry about it. She said, no, but it says so in the book. You've got to have your little finger on that key. And I have a damaged, a bent little finger, a
Mhm.
congenital defect. So it's not easy for me to play the the right hand fingering at
Mhm.
the lower end of the scale. And no, she said, that's how you do it. You have to play that. So I then went off to a tour. Actually, it was just a promotional tour in India, my first trip to India. The day after the Air India building bombing, massive, big, terrible terrorist attack. And so I was the only person in the hotel. Everybody had fled. And so I had all the journalists in Mumbai, or Bombay, as it was still called, who came to do the press call, interviews and things. And while I was there, because there was a fax machine in my bedroom, very strangely, I got someone in England to fax me the fingering chart for the flute.
Hmm.
And I realized that, at least half of everything I played was incorrect fingering. I was all everything I played in the third octave, I was just blowing harmonics without in any way the
Oh,
correct
interesting.
cross fingering or techniques to get the best intonation. So it took me about 3 months to really try and relearn everything that I played, because I had to relearn all of my own music, but with the
Right.
correct fingering. And that's when your muscle memory is such that after, this was in the probably about 1990. So I'd had 22 years of playing the flute incorrectly. It took
Right.
a while to
Some
relearn.
habits to
Yeah,
break.
it did take a while, and at the same time, I thought, well, let's make it really difficult. I'll switch to playing an open hole flute as well. So
Good
I
for you.
went,
Yeah.
went through a tortuous 3 or 4 months trying to learn.
Like a
But
rite of
the
passage.
open hole flute was great because I could then bend the notes. I could do
Exactly.
those sort of slurring things that were again more reminiscent of electric guitar playing. So
Sure.
that's how it all came about.
Which then kind of makes me curious about if you've played on any of the Robert Dick head joints that are the glissando head joints. Have you seen those?
No, I've
They're
read about them.
yeah, it's another fascinating, development on the flute, some options. And he was inspired by guitar playing and electric guitar and the sliding sound. So
Yeah, well, it's great that I know his name, and I've read some of his work about using the flute to summon unflutely and ungodly noises.
yeah,
Um, and it's sort of interesting, but
Yeah.
I think I would hate to go down in history as a guy who just did weird stuff with the flute because nobody else did. But for the largest part, it's of little use to you in the conventional flute repertoire,
Yeah.
and of little use to me as a player in a rock band, because most of his techniques involve things that you really have to be playing the instrument very sensitively and carefully to produce. I think probably the only useful thing, I suppose, would be so-called circular breathing, but it's not really circular breathing at all. It's just using air you've stored up. It's
Yep.
not as if you're breathing it in, but it's more like playing the bagpipes. You've got to have the air stored somewhere, have a quick recharge of it. But a friend of mine, originally a student of James Galway's, a chap called Andrea Griminelli, he uses circular breathing a lot in certain passages of music. And when I persuaded, because we'd done quite a few concerts together, and I persuaded him to put a microphone on the head joint of the flute and to use wireless, so that he was free to walk around the stage with me, and he could.
Yep.
But of course, because he's then has to grab a quick breath through the nose, it makes one hell of a noise into the microphone. So it was struck me as one of those things that was okay to do, even if he was standing close to an open microphone on stage. Even if he didn't have the clip-on mic on the head joint, you could still hear him doing that as he grabbed a breath, through the nose while he was still using his, upper airways to try and keep the note going. So it's these things are of limited use sometimes. I just think in most cases it's the gaps between the notes that are as important as the notes you play.
Yeah, sure.
It's like looking into a sky. If every day you just confront a cloudless sky, it's just a sea of blue.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's very pretty, but it gets pretty boring pretty quickly. And I'm a guy who likes the clouds. I like to see the clouds and the gaps between them and the spaces. To me, that's much more visually interesting. And I think the same thing about music. It's very important to have the spaces between the notes. That gives the notes a reason to be there. If you don't leave a space, if it's just blah, 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 all the way through, it just becomes, just like an angry bee gathering pollen that just seems to be, it wears you out pretty quickly. So I think phrasing, spacing, and some of the best music in the world, it has copious places in the, where you do have the opportunity to breathe, it becomes so much part of the music you play. So I'm not really thinking that there's much that I need in the way of new techniques to play the flute that would help me in my music.
What you do.
It might do in some context with some avant-garde or weird stuff, but who listens to that? People like to play it, but who actually wants to listen to it? Come
on. I mean, have you ever thought then of the materials of the flutes themselves and how that would change your sound or what you are playing? I mean, I know that you stuck with a lot of senkyos and powells and silver flutes, kind of like the standards, the old reliables. Have you ever thought of branching out? I mean, there's gold flutes, there's platinum flutes, there's alloy, there are so many different materials, and alto flutes, piccolos. Have you ever thought of branching out into these different?
I have a piccolo. I have an alto flute. I love the flute d'amour. I have two flutes d'amour.
Fascinating.
Which are
they're not made right now. Yeah.
Well, they are.
Yeah, here in the States we don't.
Altus make one in and Sankyo make a semitone lower, a flute d'amour. In fact, they made me one with open holes, and they couldn't test it out in the factory because no one had big enough hands to be able to play with the open hole keys.
Yeah.
But it does play fine. It's a lovely flute. But practically, again, on stage, it's just I think I played the flute d'amour on one occasion when I did a concert at the one of the London concert halls, which was one of those big flute occasions, just a zillion flute players and orchestras and things. And I was taken along to be the class clown, I suppose, to do something other than classical music. And I played the flute d'amour with another well-known British flautist. Played one of his compositions, but most of the time now I leave that stuff at home. I've quite often played the Indian bamboo flutes of different sizes and different keys, and of course the ubiquitous Irish tin whistle. Again, in some different keys, because you can get them made, or even you still find them, I think, in some different keys. So things that you blow into, whether it's the mouthpiece, the flageolet type of mouthpiece like a tin whistle, or whether it's a transverse flute like the Indian bamboo flute, the bansuri. It's it's all stuff that I've done, and I've used them in recordings. But I'm a simple soul. I just prefer to take one flute with me, which is a concert flute, and it's gives me the range that is most useful within the music I play. I mean, essentially, it's the same musical range as a violin, and so it's an ideal solo instrument. The piccolo, it would be very unkind to the audience to play a piccolo through.
No kidding. Yes.
Through
I think that'd be more
50,000 watt PA system. That would be little unfriendly.
Be a little much. Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd certainly shock them. You were talking a little bit about Griminelli and having classical flutist friends. I know you are friends with Griminelli, and you wrote a piece called Griminelli's Lament, and you two have performed it together. So what is it like to collaborate in this realm with classical flutists and work together with them?
It's probably a little bit more scary for them than it is for me, because I don't care, but they do. And they get a little nervous because they're out of their comfort zone, sometimes playing with a very strict tempo arrangement, sometimes different key signatures, different time signatures rather, and different kind of phrasing. Syncopation is very much to the fore in a lot of what I play. So they don't find it that easy. But then I don't find it easy to play, some Mozart flute concerto or something. I mean, for me to try and learn all that stuff is just, tortuous. It's not something that I feel I would, either then when I began or now. It's not going to help me in my musical career, whatever remains of it, to try to learn to play that and be, frankly, third rate. I would just not be that good. So I would rather do my stuff, and having other people sometimes play my stuff or even sing my stuff. I know it's quite hard for them. To me, it's kind of easy because I'm the guy who wrote it. It's in here, and it's in here too. So it's I don't need music. I don't need to have a written musical score and work to that. It's in here.
And I mean, Griminelli was, do you stay in touch with people when you work with them? Are you still close with Griminelli? He's kind of known for his close relationship with Pavarotti and all of the operatic genre. Do you feel any connection to opera through him, or what do you listen to in your spare time?
Well, Andrea has a wide circle of acquaintances and friends and great masters of their own art, and Pavarotti was certainly one of them, and he Andrea Griminelli, that is in some ways a restless soul. He likes to look at other possibilities musically, but I know he gets very nervous about it, as indeed you can understand. If you step outside the comfort zone of what you know, it's a little dangerous. You are likely to be criticized because you're perhaps not so sure of yourself in a different genre. And and Andrea's done a lot of film music in his life. That he's played not just the classical repertoire, but um, some of the classical music of, I mean, not classical in the classical sense, but classic, great Hollywood type music.
Mhm.
Um, it's good that he does that, and good for me that I stretch out a little bit and do things too. But
Yeah,
I think we have to always recognize our limitations. There are things that we can do well, and things that we struggle with. But it shouldn't all be easy. Sometimes I think you've got to push yourself, see how far you can go. But as I say, it's less embarrassing for me because I just don't care. If I play a
that's
wrong
great.
note, it's a wrong
Yeah,
note. It's jazz,
but we
So,
all, yeah, exactly.
the old adage, if you play a wrong note in my kind of music, play it again
Yeah,
4 bars later and it becomes the right note.
right.
Looks like it was on purpose. So I mean, I've played with a lot of people from well, particularly some of the great American jazz musicians
Mhm.
who've I played with quite a few of them from contemporary American jazz or jazz rock, and I mean some incredibly great players, and I can't do what they do.
Right.
I can do some of it, but when it gets harmonically very complex, I don't know all those scales and all the things that those players learn to play when they're at uh, um, Berkeley School of Music in Boston or wherever they all seem to go to learn their craft. So it's great playing that sort of stuff, but when it gets there is a level beyond which I don't feel I need to go, because repertoire wise, I've got this enormous amount of music that I've recorded over the years. In fact, I was just finishing a book of my collected lyrics, and it's something like 370 songs. Um, and add to that quite a lot of instrumental music. So it's an enormous repertoire that I have of my own stuff before I have to start worrying about Mozart
Yeah.
or
Well, I
anybody
wonder, I mean,
else.
I think I mean, speaking with you, getting to know you, you're very humble. Do you realize the effect that and the inspiration that you've had on a lot of flutists in particular, when thinking of other things to do with the flute? And how do you feel about that and having that role in what we do? I mean, there's certainly a lot of actors as well that emulate you. I don't know if you've seen the Ron Burgundy Aqualung skit, and then there's a beatboxing flutist that uh, we know here called Greg Patillo, who's very inspired by you as well. So, what's your take on all of that?
Well, I'm not the originator of that way in which that I started off playing. When I played guitar, I used to play guitar solos and do what was called scat singing. You would sing along
Yep.
roughly with what you were improvising. So your brain, your mouth, your vocal cords, and your fingers are all milliseconds apart in terms of thinking of what you're going to play next, and then you do it. It's
Hmm.
so fast. It's just and you're singing the note too. You kind of know where it's going to be, you just before you play it, and or before you sing it. So that singing along and playing thing was something that I'd already done as a teenager. And when I once borrowed a saxophone, and I realized you could sing the note as you blew into
Yeah.
the saxophone mouthpiece. You could reinforce it and make it a really raucous, aggressive noise. And when I started to play the flute, in the first few days of playing the flute, I couldn't get a pure note, especially in the lower octave. And I would sort of sing the note as I played it, and it reinforced it and made it a bit bigger. And it helped me start off the note and produce it. So I was just kind of doing that automatically. And then in the upper register of the flute, you could at least up to, say, the note of E in the third octave, it would
Hmm.
be something I could just stretch to sing those notes as well and make it really aggressive and more of a rock instrument. And I think I must have been at the Marquee, probably played 3 or 4 times at the Marquee Club, and an old friend of mine came to see us playing there, and he said, "Oh, you must come and listen to a record I just bought. It's by an American jazz musician by the name of Roland Kirk. And he's really played saxophone, well, three of them at the same time sometimes. But he also did one album called I Talk with the Spirits, which is his flute album. And like many saxophone players, he kind of doubled flutes because it's more or less the same fingering.
Right.
And he employed that technique very successfully and in a very quirky and creative way. And my friend said, "Come and listen to the record. You know, this guy, you know, he plays flute. He sounds like you, or you sound like him, whatever."
Right, that way.
But it was entirely an independent discovery. You know, Roland Kirk had obviously been doing it for a while, but I only heard him in somewhere around February or March of 1968. And one of the tunes on the record, called Serenade to a Cuckoo, stuck in my head. And I thought, yeah, I'll play that. I mean, I probably just heard it twice and picked up on the essence of it and made that into an instrumental that we played. And then I recorded in July of that year on our first album. So it became a bit of a party piece early on. Just as the year afterwards, another flute party piece was Beret, Bach's Beret, done in a sort of syncopated jazz feel.
Yeah.
And so that became, you know, I suppose my way of playing. But of course, other people were going to pick up on that. And to this day, I guess lots of people do. I mean, I meet some other flute players who play in rock or pop music, and you know, they can all sound like me. So it's not that difficult to do. I mean, a lot of it is, you know, it's facile. You know, in my days at art college, you know, I was always warned that, you know, things that look very attractive, a pencil mark or a paintbrush mark that looked in itself just very attractive, and you could repeat that and use it, and it was, you know, it was very appealing, but it was facile often. It didn't have substance. It didn't. The technique was more important perhaps than the content, and so I think you've got to always put it in that level of importance has got to be on the content of the music, the traditions of line, form, tone, color, rhythm, all words which apply in the painterly arts too. And so for me, switching from the visual arts, painting and drawing, to playing the flute, you know, the descriptions were all the same. It was all about line, form, tone, color, rhythm. It all became, you could substitute those words and the kind of way that you would use them in a composition musically, as opposed to a painterly composition. The same sort of things apply. Sure. Which, of course, explains why so many British rock musicians of the 60s and onwards did not go to music college. They went to art school, like me. We all went to art school, and we got bitten by the musical bug and the immediacy of music, as opposed to the rather more tutored, scholarly, thoughtful, and time-consuming way of making something.
But with art, you have a tangible, right? You have a physical element with art that you can hold on to. In music, it's fleeting. It's gone.
In art, there is performance art where you can almost, you know, splashing paint around and, you know, doing stuff that's where the performance is perhaps again more important than what it is you're painting. But music offers you that immediacy. You know, you are live in front of people. You have that immediate response, and so it becomes quite seductive for people who grew up with drawing and painting to suddenly find music is bang. You know, you're right there.
Are you missing that live performances right now and being out in large venues and arenas?
Yes, I've had to adjust like all musicians. We're all out of work.
Yep.
And it took 53 years, but I'm an unemployed musician now. And it's all very, you know, people say, oh yeah, but you can still record things, you can still, but my heart, in all honesty, is not really in it, because if I can't go out and perform live music, then I don't really feel I'm accomplishing much. I in the last year, I played on quite a few records for other people who've asked me to be a guest on a track or an album or whatever, and I've done that a few times. So that's a bit of an outlet, and I've done a bit of work on some of my own recording, and I have quite a lot to do during the next few weeks. But I've been saying that for the last 3 years that I must finish this album. But the thing is, when you're on tour, performing, and it's the big reward, and sitting in front of a microphone in a recording studio is
it's brutal.
somewhat sterile and missing that bit of performance magic. You have to kind of use your imagination as if you were playing live and try to conjure up those emotions and that performance skill
Yes.
to try to be creative in a recording context. But I find it easier if I'm playing somebody else's music. Then I'm just concentrating on playing the right notes or improvising and producing something that is sympathetic to what I think their song is about. But for my own purposes, I think I prefer really just to wait until such time, whenever that may be, that we can resume a degree of live performance. But
do you think that will be with the large numbers that you've seen before, or maybe you're looking forward to some more intimate performances in smaller
well,
venues?
no, intimate is absolutely the wrong thing, because we're talking
Well,
about
yeah, and social
limited
distance.
capacity. So,
Right.
in fact, if you're playing in a 2,000 capacity theatre, typical concert hall, or or a decent sized performing arts kind of theatre, then chances are we're only going to be allowed to put 50% of the people in there, to try and arrive at by structuring the seating in terms of being pairs and singles to a lesser extent, leaving spaces in between, behind, and on either side. You limit your capacity. I mean, I worked this one out back in April last year, because everything was locked down. There were no shows happening, and no shows likely to happen, we thought, for many months to come. As it turned out, it's even more months than we originally thought. But I took a couple of theatres, well-known theatres. One, a London West End theatre, in which plays, music, and stuff happen. Another one was like a performing arts centre, another part of England, of which I could get the seating plan online. And I took their seating plan and I worked out a spacing to try and create a metre gap between people, in a mixture mostly of pairs of seats, some threes, a very few fours, and a few ones, few single seats. And I got to about 67% of the theatre capacity that I thought it would be relatively safe to play in, provided everybody was wearing a proper mask, not some silly T-shirt face covering, like what you would call an N95 mask, a proper mask.
You have I mean, I read your letter to the.
One that looks like this, that really does give you a good ceiling. If you wear a decent mask, and you don't get too excited, you don't shout, you don't create more small aerosol droplets, then it will be getting relatively safe. But the big key to it is air exchange. As we know, in fact, we've known this since the studies were done back in 2003, 2008 with other corona-type viruses, that small aerosol droplet transmission is the big scary one. And air conditioning as such is not necessarily the answer, as those people who are currently holed up in the Holiday Inn in Melbourne are finding out that the small aerosol droplets permeate the air conditioning into the corridors, and people are picking up coronavirus. And now the whole place, they were there quarantined anyway. Now they're in total lockdown, and Melbourne just went into lockdown 24 hours ago again as a result. And this is with one of the new variants. So it's a pretty scary situation.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen in a theatre right now, with any of the South African variant or the so-called UK variant, the Kent variant, which is becoming very prevalent around Europe.
Yeah.
These things spread so easily. And right now, it would definitely not be safe to do an indoor concert, even to a 50% capacity, unless you had really hospital standard filtration and an air exchange, meaning that, you know, that you would exchange all the air would be filtered down to, say, well below 1 micron, to be able, like in an aeroplane, a so-called HEPA, HEPA
Yep.
filtration, then, you know, you could be reasonably secure. But it's nothing is ever going to be totally safe. And for me, the big question mark is it's not just about me feeling safe when I'm on the stage. I'm the one person in the band who can't wear a face mask. They could all wear a face mask and play the guitar, or even sing through a face mask. You know, it's there's not a big problem, but you cannot, as you probably know, cannot play the flute with a face mask on, or a saxophone, or an oboe, or a trumpet. So some of us actually have to be naked on the stage in the sense of exposing ourselves. And of course, if we're playing the flute, we tend to breathe primarily through our mouths. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, you know, trying to grab breath through your nose it produces usually a lot more noise than, you know, versus is no contest if you're working close to a microphone. So it's kind of tricky. And I think that for me, feeling safe is one thing, but it's the knowledge that because I'm there and people have come to a concert, if one person should get sick and die with coronavirus as a result of coming that night, that's going to be on my shoulders and weigh heavily on my heart. To find that out, as unfortunately I tend to do, because people will often write to me and say, "Oh, Granddad went to your concert and had a heart attack and died." I mean, joking aside, it does happen. I mean, it happened not that often, but there are several people who have died at concerts that I've done. But you know, I am less. Whilst I think it's a terrible tragedy, and of course I send my condolences and whatever to if I find out, you know, relatives and so on. But it does happen. It has happened. As long as I can remember, people have died at our concerts. Usually drug overdoses, sometimes heart attacks from being, you know, overweight or drinking too much or whatever they might be doing that's caused a heart attack. So I feel, you know, that's a bit of a risk that other people take if they go out and go to a concert, or they get overly excited. And but you know, coronavirus, different deal. You could be a fit 60-year-old and be sitting in the audience at one of our concerts and not even know perhaps that you had an underlying health condition that would make coronavirus a much more serious proposition, ending in hospitalization and perhaps death. And you know, that's something I feel I have to carry that weight of responsibility in trying to make sure things are as safe as possible for everybody. And I think that this year there is a little tiny chance, well, not tiny, maybe it's a 50% chance that we will be able to play some outdoor seated concerts in Europe. I say seated because when people are sitting in designated seats that are spaced apart and wearing face masks, they will probably behave okay.
Right.
But if they're not seated, if it's a standing audience and they're free to move, they will all come and congregate at the front.
Yep.
Very unwisely. And they can't be trusted to be sensible, especially if they've had a couple of drinks, you know. So I think seated concerts are a possibility, and outdoors you have the best air conditioning in the world for the most part, in the sense of there being a bit of a breeze and an air exchange anyway. So
you have a lot of ideas.
That may happen.
Yeah, you have clearly a lot of ideas on ways to move forward. You've shared this in a letter to the UK government, and you've written to them about your concerns and ways to move forward. Are you feeling hopeful about the future, or a little frustrated with the way things are moving in terms of government involvement?
Well, it's not just our government; it's every government in every country that we might conceivably play with and play in, and they have to make those decisions, and they'll be making the decisions probably, you know, maybe the day before a concert, which happened to us in Finland last year. We flew to Finland in March. The infection rates were about, I think, something like 30 in Finland as a whole. And actually, most of them were not in Helsinki, where we were starting a tour. They were mostly in little villages and other places far away. So there are very few cases, but in a small country like Finland, 30 infections, the government panicked, and we when we were at Heathrow Airport in London to get on the plane, I checked, everything was okay. We arrived at the other end, got off the plane, went to the hotel, and I got a phone call from the promoter saying the government have just come out of a meeting this afternoon and they've decided to cancel all public performances, and
Wow.
and that was it. It was over.
Yeah.
So our Finland tour was cancelled literally 24 hours before we should have been there doing sound check, and that is obviously really bad because that you've got so many of the expenses. I have to pay my band and the crew and the hotels and the flights and no show.
Yeah.
So no income, and these are the difficulties, that you can only make a decision based on what's happening a week before or 2 weeks before, 3 weeks before. You're going to have to make some difficult and tough decisions, and we've had concert after concert last year was postponed and pushed into 2021. Now pretty much everything in the first half of 2021 has now been pushed into 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And so we still have a lot of concerts scheduled potentially to go ahead this year, but my gut feeling is that few of them will be taking place, simply because it's not under my control. It's the governments of different countries saying, yes, you can have a concert, but with these restrictions, or we've just had a flare up of coronavirus cases in the city, everything's shut down again,
Right.
No public gatherings. And it's impossible to know, really, and impossible to plan, because as you can imagine, planning a tour and booking venues and sound systems and lighting rigs and all the people and personnel involved and selling the tickets in advance, all of this just creates a terrible mess to have to cope with when you're forced to postpone
yeah, of course,
or cancel. So very hard for people to plan anything right now. And I'm a realist. I don't talk about when the pandemic is over. I don't talk about when we have tamed coronavirus and beaten it into the ground. It's not going to happen. It will not happen. Coronavirus is going to be here, endemic in the human population for the lifetimes of my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. It will be there, just like flu. And to compare it to flu is in some ways useful, but dangerous, because of course coronavirus is rather more deadly than flu and far more likely to be spread. It is a very transmissible disease, especially these new variants, which seem to have the ability to spread so much faster and perniciously than the original Wuhan strain of the virus. So I think realistically, we have to accept that this is going to be the reality from here on in. And those of us who have traditionally earned our living by live performance are going to be facing an uncertain future, I think, frankly, for all of this year. And maybe next year it will be better. And by 2023, I would hope that with the degree to which successful vaccinations have been deployed worldwide, because of course travel is just happening all the time, and you've really got to protect the world with vaccinations before you can protect yourself properly, because people will always be spreading it again. But I think medications to treat, there'll be prophylactic medication that you will take. Actually, I do already, come to think of it. I don't have it with me, but I use a nasal spray made out of a seaweed extract, which is meant to stop you getting common flu or the common cold. Coats the inside of the nasal membranes, and I use that all the time because I'm been subject to getting bronchial infections for many years, and so I use a nasal spray. I also have a nasal powder recently developed in Israel, which is a up each nose, and that is supposedly gives you about 3 or 4 hours of very good protection against coronavirus infecting the nasal passages. You could still inhale it, of course, if you're a flute player on stage or a singer, ba 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 ba. So it's a help. So the
Sure.
prophylactic treatments, which I think will end up being probably more like to be nasal sprays or a one-shot dose, like the asthma inhaler, you know, it'd be that sort of a thing that will give
Mhm.
you a fighting chance of not being given a high viral load getting through your system.
I
The
mean, are you at
protection,
all concerned? I mean, I know that you were um, diagnosed with COPD, and are you at all concerned about COVID having more of an effect on you, and how has your
yeah.
diagnosis
Yeah,
affected your singing and
yes.
playing?
I mean, statistically, my chances are a bit better now than they were last March or April. But
Yeah.
back then, if I had got COVID, then the chances were somewhere around about 1 in 5 that I would die as a result. But now it's rather better than that.
Yeah.
It's 1 in 6. No, it's a bit. It is better because all the time treatment in hospital is getting better. So, and I have had my first dose of a vaccine. So
Good for you. Yeah.
by next week I'll be getting a bit of antibody protection,
Yeah.
hopefully. But that's no cause for celebration. It's just you've got every tool in the book.
Yes.
Whether it's nasal sprays, whether it's inhalers, whether it's vaccination, face masks, keeping your distance. Because for me, that's easy. I'm not a sociable guy anyway. I spend most of my time on tour. I'm alone in a
Yeah.
hotel room. I eat alone. I don't like to be with other people. I find the worst restaurant in town because it's empty.
Yeah.
I look for the worst Asian restaurant I can find, Indian or
Yeah.
Chinese food, the one that nobody goes to because the hotel front desk will tell you if you go there you'll get sick.
And
It's a
then that's
terrible
where they
place.
find you.
Don't go there. It's a horrible restaurant. People come back and they're throwing up and being really ill. Don't go there. So of course that's where I go because
Good.
I'm the only person having lunch, and I never get sick from
Okay,
eating at
I was
those.
gonna ask if any of that ended poorly.
No, I smile at the waiter. I check the menu carefully beforehand so that I
Yeah.
can look him in the eye or her and order from memory.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Indian food, and straight away that impresses them because you're not reading it badly off a menu, and
Right.
you actually know what you want and you remember the names, and so I try to make friends with the waiter, and hopefully a little bit of that welcome
Right.
spreads into the kitchen scenario where the chef thinks, oh yeah, apparently he's a
Yeah.
nice guy.
I'll make something good.
I'll make sure I wash my hands before I touch the poppadoms or the naans
Right.
or whatever. But no, I'm fingers crossed. I have only been sick once from eating in a bad restaurant, and I got very ill.
Wow.
About literally about an hour later, I'm seriously ill. I was fine by showtime, but it was a bad start to the afternoon.
Whew. Yeah, that sounds rough. I want to just shift gears a little bit before we finish up here to just a couple more fun, lighthearted questions. I know we went down that darker COVID road. So I guess something that a lot of people don't get to experience that you do is hearing your song play on a radio when you're just out grocery shopping, doing something. So has there ever been like a strange place that you found yourself where a song came on the radio and you were surprised, or a strange part of the world that you've been in where you heard your song playing?
Well, if it was a strange part of the world, chances are it would be part of the world where I was there because we were, doing a concert. Therefore, there would be a degree of popularity to justify going there and hopefully playing to a decent number of people. So it wouldn't be a huge surprise. But I think I have heard my music played in an elevator, which is the point where you actually do rather question what you're doing. Is this
Yeah,
when it becomes elevator music, you think
right.
this is
It's not a
this
high
is not
point.
this is not an honorable
No,
profession. You
no.
know, I should have listened to my mother and been a doctor. You know, in fact, if I should have listened to my mother and been a doctor. At least I'd have a job right now.
True.
But no, you do of course hear it, and it's. I'm afraid I'm a bit like my son-in-law. I can't bear to hear myself in public. I close my ears if I hear anything being played. run away. I'm embarrassed by
Yeah.
it. He's never seen himself in any movie or TV series or anything he's ever done. He's never watched even the
Wow.
rushes. He will
Wow.
not watch anything. He learns his lines, does the part, and literally that's it. He cannot bear to watch himself act.
Yeah.
And there's quite a few actors who have
There's a lot
that
of people like
weird
that.
same
Yeah.
sense, but as a record producer, I have to listen to myself
Yeah.
till it's driving me nuts, because
Yeah.
I have to over and over and over listen to the music collectively and mixing and mastering music. You probably hear it 1,000
Could
times.
you imagine the other scenario of you just recording and never hearing it played back and just releasing it out into the world without without
Well, I like to think that I would do it because it made me happy and I didn't really
right.
need an audience. I didn't need someone to warm to it, to give me feedback of a positive nature and make me feel good and valued. I like to think that I don't need that. But in reality, I suppose I do. I think most of us who are in the world of arts and entertainment, we do, whether we admit it or not, we do thrive on approval.
Yes.
Sometimes we thrive also on confrontation, because you have to remember that not everybody out there, even if they've paid for a ticket, especially if it's a multi-act festival context, then they're not your fans. A lot of people out there don't like you, and you have to win them over. And if you go to a country or to a new place for the first time, then you have to win those people over in the first few minutes of your performance. And so it's confrontational, but you hope that the end result is you have got their approval and they're still in their seats at the end of the concert. They didn't leave at half time.
Yeah.
And so I guess this is, you've got to be realistic that I think we all need that little bit of feeling of acceptance. It doesn't
Validation.
have to be, they don't have to overdo it. They don't need to stand up and jump around and scream and whistle and hoot and jump in the air. I'm perfectly happy just to see a smile on the face and that's
Yeah.
good for me.
Yeah.
But I'm a reserved person. I don't go much beyond just a polite applause, and I'm perfectly happy if that's what I get. Happier actually if they don't overdo it. When people go nuts, I think it's the beer talking, not necessarily honest
Right.
emotional approval. Sometimes
Right.
people just overreact in all kinds of ways. So
Sure.
I'm very happy with polite applause.
Well, here's your polite applause for me. You were great today. Thank you so much for your time and for carving out the time to chat with us. We really are very honored and really appreciative. So thanks for sharing.
I'm
And
going to share just one little thing that you
of
did
course,
ask me this, and I didn't really get around to answering the
oh
question
yeah,
about people trying to learn from me in some way in terms of what I do as a flute player. And I am not a teacher. I can't, not interested in trying to teach people how to play the flute, but I do think it's very important to pass on to any young musician, not just flute players, and particularly younger musicians, give it everything you've got, but have a plan B and a plan C, because realistically, few are able to enter the world of professional music and earn a good living for the rest of their lives. So, if you invest perhaps 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years of your life into really working and learning your instrument, I think you've got to be realistic and have a backup plan. It shouldn't stop you giving it 100% of your effort when you're doing it, but don't burn your bridges.
right.
keep some options out there, and I think that's a good thing to always carry in your head, is to accept that you may be disappointed, and that's number one. Number two is try to throw away the written music for an hour every day. Toss it over your shoulder and play a few notes. Play a few wrong notes, because that will help you learn which ones are the right notes in terms of improvising and coming up with little tunes of your own, doing whatever. Throw away the music and just try and play from here and from here, and don't be afraid of making a mess. Don't be afraid of the wrong notes or bad phrasing or bad playing. Don't be afraid of making the mistakes. In privacy in your own rehearsal room or private space, then go and make lots of mistakes and have fun, because when you come back, when you then pick up the scattered music off the floor and put it back on the music stand, you will have learned a little bit of something about music in the meantime, and that little bit of something is about emotions and responses and perhaps technique too. So you can apply that to playing, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and perhaps endow them with a little bit of greater substance as a result of being led off the leash.
Yes.
Think of yourself as a playful puppy, and your owner unclips the leash and says, "Go, go," and the joy of running around and going nuts. That's what you should always try and make a little space every day to play the flute that way. And I think it will be, if nothing else, it will be fun. And music should also be about fun as well as discipline, and the nail biting tremors and fear of upsetting your music teacher, or indeed a classical music audience sitting there with the critics in the front row ready to write nasty things about you. You have to cope with all of that stuff too, but you deserve an hour off to go nuts like a playful puppy.
That's perfect advice.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was it.
Thank you so much. Thanks again.
Okay. Good to talk to you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.